Hello, everyone. My name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I call this episode Coastal California UFO Contact Cluster 5 True Cases. Each UFO encounter provides another piece of the puzzle to solving the UFO mystery and helps us understand the ET presence on our planet. And in this episode, I'd like to present to you 5 cases which I think contain some very unusual and in some cases unique elements which provide some interesting insights into UFOs and extraterrestrials. And what I find particularly interesting about these cases is that they all took place within a very small radius of each other and very nearly the same location. I chose these 5 out of well over 150 encounters, so I hope you'll find it interesting. And let's just get started. And the first case I'd like to talk about, I call walkie-talkie UFOs, Paul Allionne's encounters. Paul Allione is an attorney based in Southern California, and as a young boy, he had a very interesting encounter outside his home in Palos Verdes. This was in December of 1968. He went outside one evening and saw a strange string of lights hovering over the ocean not too far from his home. And I'll just let Paul describe in his own words what happened. As Paul says, "I looked up, and on the horizon I saw a set of lights that were unlike any other lights I'd ever seen before. At first, I thought it was a helicopter with a perfectly straight string of Christmas lights on the bottom because the lights were green, red, and white. But it wasn't moving like any flying object I had seen. It just hovered. And while it was hovering, it very slowly started to tilt from a perfectly horizontal position to an angle, but very slowly, and while continuing to hover in one place. I really, to this day, can't tell you what it was. It's nothing I've ever seen before or since." So as he was watching it, the tilt was so severe that it was clear to him that this was not a normal aircraft. Paul rushed inside his home and grabbed his new walkie-talkies that he had received as a Christmas gift. And he thought to himself, "I'm going to try to talk to this thing," thinking like a kid. And to his shock, he actually intercepted what he believes is a ship-to-shore transmission and could actually hear them talking about this sighting. He could see a ship floating out in the water very close to these lights, and it appeared that he was picking up the transmission from this ship. And he heard a voice, a male voice, clearly say, "I don't know what the hell that is. It's about 200 yards off my bow, and it's starting to tilt." And it was clear to Paul that whoever was talking was clearly as excited and amazed as he was. So he's freaking out. He rushed inside to get his dad, and by the time they got back outside, this object was gone. The very next day, Paul received vindication when the evening news came on and started talking about, quote, "strange lights over the water." Evidently, the station was flooded with calls, and the news actually sort of debunked the sighting and blamed it on 2 college kids setting off weather balloons. Even at that age, Paul knew that this was a ridiculous explanation. It didn't even come close to matching what he saw. And as he says, "To me, that confirmed what I saw as being a legitimate anomaly." So years later, Paul did appear on UFO History Channel's UFO Hunters to describe his sighting. And he searched for confirmation going back into newspaper reports, but was not able to find any confirmation. However, as he says, "Anyway, there's my one and only encounter with a UFO, but I can assure you it was very real." So this is an interesting sighting in a number of ways. It's one of many in this one area. And also, it was apparently very widely viewed. not only by whoever was on this ship, but by many people presumably along the shore, because the news allegedly received a bunch of calls, and yet they provided a debunking explanation. And I think this just goes to show that there is, in fact, a UFO cover-up. There's still ridicule at that time, certainly, surrounding this subject, and it wasn't being taken seriously or treated objectively. At any rate, it's a pretty interesting sighting, and that's why I wanted to share it with you. And the next case I'd like to talk about, I call The UFO Followed Us, George Gray's Encounter. George Gray is a pseudonym. He does not want his name used. He's an employee in the movie business and in fact worked on the movies Star Trek, the motion picture, and other Star Trek movies. And his encounter occurred in Santa Monica, and it was the week after Easter in 1975. George was driving alone in his car along the Santa Monica Freeway, the 10 freeway heading west. Behind him, in convoy, his sister was driving along with her boyfriend. George had recently moved into the area and was transporting his stuff. And looking out over the ocean while still driving on the freeway, he saw a very unusual object. And I will just let George describe in his own words what he saw and what happened. As George says, I thought at first it was a helicopter, because helicopters have spotlights. You know, it was over the ocean, but all of a sudden I noticed that the light just zoomed towards Palos Verdes at a tremendous rate of speed and then zoomed right back. That blew me away. I thought, wait a minute, this is just moving too fast. And then I noticed when it stopped, it sent down a beam of light. I know helicopters have spotlights, but this was an incredibly different type of light. It was like a cylinder of light actually being lowered down, like a cylinder. I have never seen light do that before. Most light will scatter. This stayed completely uniform, like a cylinder would be lowered down. And the light was a brilliant bluish-green light. I could see the beach where the wet sand was because it illuminated it. And within this cylinder of light, it would send even smaller cylinders of light within it. And those were even brilliant, like a yellow, lime green, and an orange cylinder, also within this other cylinder. I was seeing this, and I said, whoa. I knew right then and there I was witnessing a UFO. As it turns out, George is very familiar with aircraft. His father worked on the Apollo moon missions. George himself was a huge astronomy buff and an aircraft enthusiast, and he knew what he was seeing was unusual, not only because of the way it darted across the sky, but this unusual beam of light that it was sending down. So he began sending thoughts of love to this object, trying to sort of make telepathic contact with it. He also slowed down, honked his horn, and pointed out this object to his sister and her boyfriend. At this point, they were very close to the beach, and they went through the McClure Tunnel, which leads from Santa Monica to the Pacific Coast Highway. And as he drove through the McClure Tunnel and reached the beach, he could see the UFO was still there, and he and his sister quickly pulled over and got out of their car. And as George says, and I quote, "We pulled over and the UFO followed us. I jumped out of the van and I started walking towards it. The UFO was over where the beach was, where the wet sand was, hovering maybe 100 to 200 feet in the air. It was silver. It was your basic UFO, like two saucer shapes. It was a light at first because it was still dark. But when we finally got there, the sun had started to come up. It was definitely completely metallic, with a silver dome on top and a silver dome on the bottom of it, like two plates put together. And they had little lights around it. It was really something to see. Maybe 100 feet across. It was a relatively big craft, and it was completely metallic. definitely a silver metallic object and shiny. And once the sun was breaking through, you could really see it was beautifully buffed, almost like a liquid mirror, like mercury, metallic. It was highly buffed. So as he's watching it send down this beam of light onto the beach, it actually scared away a flock of seagulls. George was very much drawn to it and was continuing to make telepathic contact with it. And in fact, he felt that he was successful and that it knew he was there and watching it. As he says, and I quote, "I really believe that it came back when I started to use communication, telepathy, because it came back, and when I pulled over, it was there. It hovered there, and it acknowledged that we were there. But then it just took off straight up. We could see it. It didn't just disappear. It went shoo, and it was gone. It just took off." So what's interesting to me about this case is the whole telepathic contact aspect of it. This is something I hear quite often, and telepathy occurs not only when people have an onboard experience, but with sightings as well. And another really interesting aspect about this is how George describes this beam of light coming down out of the craft, moving slowly, like a cylinder. It didn't obey the inverse square law of light, which causes light scattering. Instead, this was a very narrow beam, and it moved slowly down. So this was a very opaque beam of light, coherent light, thick that you could not see through it, with these multicolored aspects to it. Clearly not normal light. So why was it sending down this beam of light? Was this a little display for George? I think very possibly it was. And it was its way of saying hello. I'm purely speculating here, but it's a very interesting case nevertheless. And the next case I'd like to present to you, I call "We Had No Idea What It Was: Donald and Bonnie's Encounter." This occurred in the summer of 1980 in the same general area in Santa Monica, just a few miles from the beach. Bonnie and Donald have 2 children, and they were drawn outside when they saw this very strange object hovering quite high in the sky. And in fact, they were not the only ones who saw it. Their neighbors saw it as well. So there was a group of about 6 people watching this object. And I'll just let Bonnie describe what they were looking at. As Bonnie says, "We all came outside and looked at it. My husband saw it, and my other 2 kids saw it, and it was absolutely quiet, and it was just hovering. It wasn't a helicopter or anything, because there was no noise. It was a red light, and it was the shape of a half pie pan, like a half circle, and it was red. It was out there long enough that the next door neighbors came out and looked at it too. We got the binoculars out. We had no idea what it was. We just kept saying, 'What on earth could it possibly be if there's no noise and it's just hovering?' We don't know how far away it was. I know that it's never been up there before or since. It did kind of move around a little bit from side to side, but mainly it just hovered." Bonnie's husband, Donald, also confirmed these details, also looked at this object through the binoculars, and as Donald says, "We just don't know what it was," which I guess is what a UFO is. "But we went outside and looked up in the sky. I don't remember who saw it first, but it appeared to be stationary, and we watched it for the longest time. Got out the binoculars. I can't tell you how high it was. It wasn't a plane. It stayed in the same place, and it was a lot brighter than anything else around." After about 15 minutes, this object departed. Bonnie and Donald are not sure if it just winked out and disappeared, or if it zoomed off really fast. As Bonnie says, it was just gone. It just went away. And while this is a simple sighting, it does have some very interesting aspects to it. It had a very weird shape, Also, the way Bonnie and Donald described it being stationary in the sky, it wasn't completely stationary. It wobbled a little bit, moving back and forth. This is a detail that does turn up in many UFO accounts, and I think shows how these objects are powered or maneuvering using the magnetic fields of our planet, which are not completely stable. So UFOs, as a general rule, will sort of wobble and waver a little bit. Another very interesting aspect of this case is that they were able to use binoculars to get a close-up view of it, and still were not able to identify it. And they never saw anything before or since, and the fact that this thing moved away so fast is another clue that this remains unidentified. Not to mention also the fact that it made no noise. And there is a very interesting and I think significant endnote to this case. It was 2 days later that Bonnie's parents, who lived in the neighboring suburb of Mar Vista, just a short distance away, saw what appears to be the same exact craft. And as Bonnie says, "My parents live 5 miles away from me. They saw the same thing. And their neighbors went out and looked at it, and nobody knew what it was. It was unidentified. It was described just like our red thing, like red lights." So is this a coincidence? Is this, pure synchronicity? Very hard to say, but honestly, I don't think so. I mean, what are the chances that her parents would have the same exact sighting 2 days later and also have their neighbors come out? It's a very interesting coincidence at the least, and I really wonder if this UFO was showing itself on purpose and sort of, again, announcing its presence like they often do. It's an interesting case. And this next case that I'd like to present also has some of these same similar and very interesting details. I call this next case, "We Didn't Know What to Do, Toshi Inoue's Encounter." This occurred in the summer of 1980 in the same place, although slightly off the coast this time. Toshi Inoue is a pilot and flight instructor. This occurred in the summer of 1980, and Toshi was flying with a student over Santa Monica Bay. He was basically teaching the student how to fly and showing him instrumentation and all of this. They were flying at about 2,000 feet of elevation, very close to sunset, and Toshi was just showing the student all the instrumentation and had just called the control tower and gotten clearance to land at Santa Monica Airport when the attention of him and his student was drawn to a huge glowing red cigar-shaped object not very far from their plane. It was clearly unexplained, and as Toshi says, this one was cigar-shaped. It was red, glowing red in the shape of a cigar, about 2 to 3 times bigger than a bus. It looked like a light, but it looked like a shiny, shiny light. It showed the shape of it. It wasn't a bright light. I couldn't see any detail of it, just a reddish cigar shape. It was a cigar-shaped light. Toshi, as a pilot, is a trained observer and very familiar with aircraft, but he still couldn't identify it, and it really quite startled him. As Toshi says, "We were at about the shoreline of Santa Monica to Pacific Palisades. Usually, the tower advises us of other traffic, but they didn't, right? We were looking at it about 20 or 30 seconds. It was standing still in the air, glowing red. We were kind of stunned. We didn't know what to do. So I grabbed the other microphone, and I was going to ask if there was any other traffic nearby. I was going to ask the tower, but we didn't. And I'm glad I didn't ask because it was kind of like asking if there was another object that looks like a flying saucer." So Toshi was very reluctant to report this UFO uh, because of the ridicule factor, because of the possible reaction of skepticism. And shortly after, while he was trying to decide whether or not to report this thing, this object quickly darted away. And as Toshi says, he was looking at it, the student, I was looking at it, and then all of a sudden, it disappeared. It disappeared while we were looking at it, which means that the object moved away with a very, very fast speed. And that was the end of Toshi's encounter. But again, there's a twist to the ending of all this, a very interesting end note. As Toshi says, and I quote, "This student was in a car driving over the Santa Monica Mountains with his friends." This was about 2 weeks later. "He said that they were chased by the object. According to him, the object looked like it was following their car. According to him, it was the same one. The object looked like the same shape we saw in the airplane." So there you go, another very unusual aspect to this case. Pilot encounters are themselves quite rare, so that alone I think makes this case significant. Toshi's reluctance to report a UFO to the tower is a clear indication of how effective the UFO cover-up has been, and I think it shows that probably the vast majority of pilot encounters goes unreported. But what I find most interesting about this is first they had their sighting, and then 2 weeks later, the student had another sighting. And I just don't think this is a coincidence, because often this is a pattern I see. A person will have an initial encounter, and shortly later, they will have a much closer and more dramatic encounter. So perhaps this indicates that there are deeper levels of contact going on here. Very hard to say, but it is a really sort of interesting and unusual aspect to this particular case. And that's why I wanted to put it on this list. And the next and final case I'd like to talk about in this episode, I call "What the Hell is Going On? David Russo's Encounter." David Russo is a retired attorney. His encounter took place on the beach at Long Beach, and he actually contacted me to report his case. And like Paul Allione, David Russo also appeared on the History Channel's program UFO Hunters to present his encounter. So I would just like to read to you the email that David Russo first sent to me to report his encounter. As he writes, "I am sending you this email with great reluctance and fear of being thought a kook. I am a retired attorney, a UFO skeptic, and a pretty scientific-minded man. I am 51, father of 2, and a grandfather to 1 with another on the way. I live 2 blocks from the ocean on Long Beach, along a part of the city that looks directly at Catalina Island." David Russo's encounter occurred on August 4th, 2006 at 11:30 p.m. when he went to the beach to just take a look at the stars in the ocean late one evening. This is something he had done many times, but on this particular evening, he had an encounter which would leave him forever and profoundly changed. And again, I would just like to quote David Russo and let him describe his encounter in his own words. As David says, "An object coming from the west around the San Pedro area caught my attention. It was white and moving somewhat faster than a plane would have. It continued southwest toward the many oil islands off the coast of Long Beach. It changed colors from a white to a very cool and neat blue color as it slowed and started hovering over the water. It's hard to guess how far away it was, especially at night and over the ocean, but it was probably a mile or so offshore. I feared it was indeed a small plane or a helicopter crashing into the ocean. Instead, at a height I estimate between 15 to 25 feet, the object stopped. It just stopped on a dime. Then I realized this was something different. The object then turned a blue color and hovered in place for what seemed like 20 to 30 seconds. No spotlight came on, though it did illuminate the area underneath it with its blue glow. At this point, David could see that this was a distinctly triangular-shaped object, totally silent, and pretty close offshore, less than a mile at this point. And as he says, it was quite bright blue as it rotated. I could tell it was rotating because the blue light would be interrupted 3 times at equal intervals. There might have been a blue light on the underside, but I could not tell with any certainty. After what seemed like 15 seconds or so, it rose higher, changed to a reddish-orange color, and zipped off toward Catalina Island direction very quickly, and then disappeared as it continued to rise and move away. I have never seen anything move that fast. It was amazingly fast. So after it moved off and disappeared, David Russo was really shaken. I mean, this sighting affected him profoundly. He could not stop thinking about it. As he says, with time, this incident has caused me a mixture of anxiety, depression, and an odd elation. I really want to know what this was, but I know I never will. I have taken to going to the shore at night with binoculars in my digital camera. It has become an embarrassing obsession. He heard no sound, so he knows this wasn't anything normal. He ended up spending quite a bit of money on equipment in the hopes of observing this type of thing again. As of yet, this hasn't happened, but it really affected him in a very, very deep way. And that was a real red flag for me. As he wrote to me in his testimony, he says, "I hope this helps you. It feels good to get this off my chest. What the hell is going on? Why doesn't the press investigate this stuff with any energy? I have kept this bottled up for many months, and the whole thing gives me both a creepy and exciting feeling." So as I mentioned, David Russo did agree to share his encounter on the History Channel's program, UFO Hunters, along with Paul Allione and another witness. He still feels profoundly changed by his encounter. And as I interviewed him, I was not really surprised to hear that this wasn't his first encounter. And in fact, he had had an encounter as a young boy while in the Boy Scouts out camping. He had a very close encounter. And as I talked to him about this current encounter, I was struck by a couple of things. One was his very strong emotional reaction to this encounter, his feeling not only of elation, but of depression and obsession. This is a red flag, often points to deeper levels of contact. So I started to question him about this. How far away was this object? Because when an object comes close, that's also another red flag. And while this object wasn't super close, it was within that radius that I look for to indicate possible deeper levels of contact. And then I asked him about time. How long were you looking at this object? Did you check the time? And he started to get a little anxious at this point, because he said, honestly, I couldn't tell you. It seemed like time stopped. I was entranced. I don't know how long this lasted. He had some confusion about time. And that is another huge red flag, which I told him that there could very well be deeper levels of contact here. So I'm not saying he was taken on board. We have no direct indication of that. But given the fact that he had an early childhood encounter, which often happens with contactees, given that this object showed up right where he was looking, right when he arrived, and came quite close to him, given his very strong emotional reaction to it, this feeling of elation, obsession, depression especially, I think it could very well be that there was some level of contact here. So I don't know. It's hard to say. Only David would know for sure. And at this point, he hasn't pursued it. But as he says, and I quote, "I would rather have not seen it. Now, there's this little piece back here that is always wondering and always thinking, what the heck did I see? And will I ever know?" So there you go. Those are the 5 encounters I wanted to present to you today, which I find so interesting because they all occurred in virtually the same area, and each of them provides little clues as to the nature of this phenomena. How sometimes an object will show up once and then shortly later show up again. It shows how unusual the lights are. This beam of light that George Gray saw shows how UFOs have mastered the use of the electromagnetic spectrum to a way that we haven't. Or how these witnesses describe how these lights can stop on a dime, dart off so fast you can't follow it, sort of waver slightly while hovering. All of these are little clues that show how profoundly advanced this technology is. I did present these cases in a couple of my books, including UFOs over Topanga Canyon, and more recently in my book, Undersea UFO Base, an in-depth investigation into USO activity in the Santa Catalina Channel. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, each case, no matter how simple it is unique and provides another piece of puzzle and provides really important insights into the nature of the UFO phenomena. And these cases, I think, have quite a bit to say about UFOs, and that's why I wanted to present this episode for you today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I really want to thank you once again for watching. I truly appreciate it. And until next time, keep searching for answers, keep looking for the truth, and most importantly, and I'm serious about this, keep having fun. Bye.